Hey there, friends. My name's Matthew, and I'm the C# artisan. And today I'm really excited because we're starting a brand new video series covering a really important topic. We're going to be taking a deep dive into Azure Service Bus. Now, before we get started writing any code, I wanted to stop and talk a little bit about terminology and definitions. Because when we talk about Azure Service Bus and similar technologies like Kafka or RabbitMQ, there are a lot of different terms that get thrown around, and frankly, it can be really confusing. Perhaps you've heard of terms like queue or topic, service bus, message broker, receiver, sender, producer, consumer, an event, a subscription, pub sub, hub and spoke. What are all these terms and how do they relate? And which ones apply to Azure Service Bus? So that's what we're going to take a little look at. And for starters, what I want us to do is kind of go back a little bit into our computer science background, if you have one, and talk about some really fundamental data structures. The one on the left is a queue, and the one on the right is a stack. Now, a queue is a first in, first out data structure. So what that means is when you put an item into the queue, it goes down like this. Your items go in order, and then they come out in that same order. So first in, first out. A stack is a different data structure. With a stack, the items go in like that, but they come out in the reverse order. So the last one in is the first one out. So that's just a little refresher on the difference between a queue and a stack. And what we are going to be talking about is queues, because Azure Service Bus is really Microsoft's Azure Queue technology. The original Microsoft Queue technology was called Microsoft Message Queue, MSMQ. And that goes way back. And actually, I'm going to show you something just a little bit embarrassing. So, well, I don't know if it's embarrassing, but kind of fun. So this here is a copy of Delphi Informant magazine from, what is this? August or April of 2003. And if you'll see, there's an article down here on queued components. And in the prior month, there was another article on MSMQ, both written by yours truly. So I've been working with queues for a long time. That's over 20 years. It's a foundational technology that you should be aware of. So it's important to understand queues. First in, first out data structure that preserves the strict ordering of the items in the queue. So when you're dealing with a queue, there's some vocabulary that's important to know. Now, formally, the process of putting something in the queue is called enqueuing, right? We're actually putting the message in. We're going to enqueue something. So let's enqueue a message. And often these are called elements that go in the list or in the queue. And then getting something out of the queue is called dequeuing the message. So you enqueue and then you, flip it upside down. You dequeue. So this kind of terminology, enqueue, element, dequeue, it's a little bit old-fashioned and formal. So what you're more likely to see people talk about is sending an item to a queue, and that the item itself is called a message, and receiving an item out of the queue. So you send a message, it goes in the queue, and then you receive it, and it comes out of the queue. And so in a lot of ways, like a mailbox, like your email mailbox, functions quite a bit like a queue, especially if you keep it in the same order and process them in order. Then you're doing queue-based processing, which we never do for our email. But send, receive, and a message. And so that tells us that the piece of code or the client or that is putting things in is called the sender. And the thing that is getting them out is called a receiver. So when you have a single sender and a queue and a single receiver, this is what it looks like. So there's one other piece of vocabulary to know about. And let me send or enqueue a few messages. So what if you're the receiver and you are curious to know what's going on in the queue? You could always receive the first message, but what if you're curious about the other ones? So many queue technologies have a concept called peeking. And what peeking lets you do is kind of look at a message without receiving it. So in Azure Service Bus, it is possible to do this, but it's not called peeking, and it's an interesting technique that we'll look at. So here is our basic queue: sending, receiving messages. So what about Azure Service Bus? I mean, bus? What are they talking about? What kind of bus is this? Is this the kind of bus that they mean? So in electronics, there is this concept of a bus in electronics. You're familiar with it, of course. You've got your universal serial bus, which you use to connect all kinds of components on your computer. And maybe you've built computers and you understand that deep down there's a bus that sits between the CPU and the memory. So in electronics, a bus is a thing that lets you share data between multiple components. And in general, it could be bidirectional, and often it's hardwired. So the concept of a bus with lots of components wired together in complex patterns and maybe some sort of dispatching of messages and data across, to me, it doesn't really model what Azure Service Bus actually is. So what is Azure Service Bus? And we're going to soon, when you go into the Azure portal and you look to set things up, it lets you only set up two kinds of things. It lets you set up what are called queues, and it lets you set up topics. So within Azure Service Bus, a queue is a queue, right? And you can put messages in the queue, message 1, message 2, going from the sender into the queue. That's really straightforward. That's what we just talked about. Well, what is a topic? So in the case of a topic, it's really a multi-receiver queue. So when you send a message to a topic, it actually creates multiple copies of the message. So it's kind of like the queue has one input and then branches, and there are multiple output queues. And so then when we send a second message, this message also gets placed in all of the receiver queues. So a topic is the input side and a subscription is the output side. And what can happen is receiver 1 here could read message 1, right? And then read message 2, and it has no impact on the other receivers. Then the other receiver could go read message 1, and maybe nobody ever receives these, and they just stay there forever and eventually time out. The key point here is there is nothing inside of Azure Service Bus that I have found except queues, right? It doesn't have this bidirectional routing of data. It's not a bus as far as I can tell. It is simply a couple of ways to set up and manage queues. So we're going to move on from here, but the key thing is for you to understand what a queue is and that Azure Service Bus really is a tool for managing queues in Azure.